because it's a little lower. It has to be connected to the ground here. Closer to the ground here. No. Yeah, we do more absolutely. Absolutely. Shall we begin? Oh, not yet. Okay. Let us begin. Let us jump right into this critique of academic moral philosophy. If you recall, last week, Brother Roberto and Professor Unger and I talked about the distinction between philosophy as a way of life and philosophy as an academic discourse, and the ways in which metaphilosophy informs ethics, the way in which certain kinds of ethical theories are preoccupied with rules and preoccupied with methods and preoccupied with justification, usually justifications that are holding history at arm's length. And what we want to do today is to take a brief look at some of the varieties of moral thinking in the academy, especially in the last 150 years or so. E.g., utilitarianism in all of its various forms, rule utilitarianism and act utilitarianism, consequentialism, the species of utilitarianism, Kantianism. Won't be able to touch on all of the different kinds of Kantianism, but certain basic assumptions and presuppositions that inform Kantianism, and then the ways in which they tend to feed into contract theory when it comes to understanding how social arrangements ought to be morally and legally regulated. But I want to begin with the invoking of one of the towering philosophers of the 20th century, Gertrude Elizabeth Margaret Anscombe. Gertrude Elizabeth Margaret Anscombe, usually known as Elizabeth Anscombe. She wrote a powerful text in 1958, January of 1958, in Philosophy Journal. It's worth taking a look at. It's called Modern Moral Philosophy. And it's one of the starting points of any serious reflection of academic moral philosophy from the vantage point of someone who is on the inside of the academy but happens to have deep sensibilities, Professor Unger and myself, and that's always a nice way of proceeding. Because as we mentioned last week, anytime you talk about academic moral philosophy, you're not talking about every academician who does moral philosophy. There's ways of being critical of the academy within the academy, just as you can go to the barber shop and beauty salon and get some academic reflections on moral philosophy too. So it's not a matter of a kind of reductionist understanding of institutional sites. And Anscombe, and many of you might recognize her, she's a translator of Ludwig Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations. She was the only one that Wittgenstein relied upon to translate his work, and actually he asked her to translate his work before she knew a word of German. She went to Vienna to learn German, but Wittgenstein said, you are the one who understand what I'm doing. She had been studying with Wittgenstein for many years as a student at Oxford, and she would take the transportation, take the vehicles over to Cambridge to study with Wittgenstein, and she wrote some powerful texts on her own, Intentions and so on. She was also a very famous Catholic philosopher. She's also known for the one who wrote the pamphlet critical of Harry Truman when he was given an honorary degree at Oxford. She called him a mass murderer, given what happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, just bearing witness, as it were, very explicitly. So, and you can imagine, too, as a towering Catholic philosopher, she was very critical of abortion and got arrested over and over again in front of abortion clinics. But she was someone who had a connection with the more ancient or pre-modern ways of engaging in moral thinking and ethical reflection. Very, very important. Now, in this essay, she has three fundamental theses. The first thesis is that we can call it the moratorium thesis. She says, we at present cannot afford to do moral philosophy. Now, this is an interesting claim. Here's a moral philosopher in a philosophy journal saying we cannot afford to do moral philosophy. Why? Because we do not have an adequate philosophy of psychology. It's conspicuously lacking. So we ought to hold off on engaging in such narrow and truncated ways of engaging the world. Now, the second claim was that our notions of moral duty and moral obligation are survivals and derivatives of earlier conceptions of ethics. And therefore, if it's psychologically possible, we should jettison our use of moral duty and moral obligation. And you can imagine this is already a major attempt to engage in an indictment of most of moral discourse in the academy. Because so much begins with duty, especially in the Kantian model, and obligation. And then her third claim was that moral philosophy, since Sidgwick in the English-speaking world, has very, very little differences and is of little importance. So she already prefigures the convergence thesis that we get in Derek Parfit. Now, why are these claims crucial? Why ought we to take them seriously? And why, in fact, do they feed into what we're trying to do in the next 10, 12 weeks or so? Well, 13 years later, Alasdair MacIntyre writes the classic called After Virtue. I'm sure many of you have read that text. And if you haven't had a chance to read that text, it is worth your while. I mean, there's certain books that you don't want to die before you read, like Tolstoy's War and Peace or Toni Morrison's Beloved. Alasdair MacIntyre, it's not as if you don't want to die, but if you get sick, because it's a minor classic, it's not a major classic, but it is an indispensable text for anybody who wants to take seriously modern thinking about ethics and morality. And in the first chapters of that text, he makes exactly the same move that Anscombe makes. He says, imagine what it's like to live in a culture that talks about rights, but little talk about what it is to have certain kinds of persons with certain kinds of character and certain kind of soul crafts in place to be able to locate and situate those rights. It's like invoking neutrinos and have no sense of modern physics. And that's very much what he understands the modern world to be, shot through with these derivatives and survivals of duty, obligation, utility, consequences, with very little sense of the larger context. And this is very important because so much of modern academic philosophy and moral philosophy has a fear of context, fear of historical context, fear of social context, economic context. Because once you bring in context, things get messy. And so much of modern philosophy in the academy, and especially modern ethical philosophy in the academy, wants a certain kind of clarity that is illuminated by means of rigorous reflection on method and rules. And rules and method usually are the major means by which one holds at arm's length changing dynamic contexts that allow us to come to terms with what it is to be the kind of organisms and vanishing creatures we are in space and time. In fact, I think we made it fairly clear, and we'll be making it more and more clear throughout this class, that any serious discussion about philosophy as a way of life, any serious discussion about first-order moral projects begins with being in time, in history, in context. And I should say always, there's one slogan, the great Frederick Jameson, probably the leading Marxist literary critic in the last 50 years in this nation, teaches at Duke now, still alive. He begins all of his classes by saying, historicize, contextualize, pluralize. Historicize, contextualize, pluralize. We are subjects shot through with various contexts that need to be historicized, and when you historicize them, you're talking about pluralizing the varieties, the forms, the heterogeneities that go hand in hand in the making of who we are. Now, I prefer the term of Samuel Beckett, who called it the mess. So what it is to be human is in the mess. We can go with George Clinton, in the funk. Same point. Fears, anxieties, insecurities, trying to come to terms with the messes and the funks in which we find ourselves, trying to gain access with traditions which themselves are social and historical practices, which means we have to come to terms with ever shaping contingencies. So much of modern economic philosophy is a fear of context and contingencies. It wants to render things static, stationary, ossified, petrified. Not just slow it down, but gain distance from the variable, the changeable, very much like Plato's Republic. That turning of the soul that shifts from the world of becoming to that of being, from variability to invariability. The eternal, the necessary, the universal is always something to be achieved by means of suppressing, holding at arm's length, pushing back context and contingencies. The point of Anscombe, maybe I should write Brother McIntyre's name here too. McIntyre actually is more well known, and Elizabeth should be much more well known. There is no Alasdair MacIntyre's after virtue without modern moral philosophy, making the similar kind of point that feeds into the kinds of concerns we have when it comes to the existential, the experiential, the historical, and the contextual and contingent. Last but not least, a fear of the concrete. And we could say the dynamic of concrete. And these, of course, are not identical, but they're indivisible. They all go hand in hand. They all go hand in hand. And by concrete, we're talking about not just a contingent in the broad sense, but what we talked about last week. What it means to be human, what it means to die, what it means to learn how to die while you are human before you physically die. That's what we love about Socrates. He's always raising the how to live. And the conclusion and the response is your answer, not some broad answer only. You've got to live your life. What does it mean to learn how to die? Criticize yourself. Scrutinize yourself. Give up certain assumptions and presuppositions as forms of death in order to live. So you're able to live more intensely, critically, concretely. And one way of talking about this is just talking about the centrality of change and transformation and how we conceive of ourselves as human beings involved in first-person moral projects. That's what makes it existential. It's not when we use the word existential that Sartre and Camus and early Heidegger and others have some monopoly on that discourse. See, Socrates is existential. Kierkegaard was existential. Montaigne was existential. Pascal was existential. Epicurus was. Epictetus was. We have to wait to get 20th century. Paris, left bank, to get existential. It's always already at work in a variety of different traditions. And when we turn then to utilitarianism, when we turn then to consequentialism, when we turn into Kantianism, and then on to contract theory, what do we see? Well, on the one hand, you get this principle of utility as a way of displacing these longer traditions of what it means to be human, what are the conditions under which people can change and choose and be transformed. And you can appeal to one abstract principle that allows one to, Russ, what? Act as right or wrong. It would be fascinating to engage in a genealogy of the discourse of modern utilitarianism. You could imagine we don't have time to engage in such a discourse. Usually people go back to Jeremy Bentham in his text of 1789, Principles of Moral Political Legislation. But we could go back to William Paley, go back to John Gay. It has a history that's very much tied into a fundamental rejection of older ways of doing ethics, an attempt to put at the very center of ethical discourse what appears to be a transparent principle to which we can appeal as a way of achieving certain kinds of ends. Now, the Frankfurt School would call this instrumental rationality. We can even be more austere and severe and call it technocratic rationality. We talked before about the challenge of science on the one hand, markets on the other, and the nation state, last week I called it nationalism, and the nation state on the other. And as you can imagine, it's quite understandable that any person involved in serious thinking about ethics is going to be concerned about the challenge of the authority of science. And how do you get a more scientific approach to ethics? But how do the scientists do it? Bless you. They're able to abstract from the concrete. They're able to generate laws of physics and nature. They're able to hold at arm's length history in order to manipulate, predict the future in light of the past. If they can generate unbelievable breakthroughs in knowledge, how come we can't do that? Hence, more and more the ethical thinkers say, let's be scientific in this way. And to be scientific is to radically call into question a lot of the cognitive commitments that you get from the earlier philosophical traditions of ethics. And it's not just appeals to God, but it's appeals to certain notions of virtue, certain notions of character, and so forth and so on. It's no accident that Anscombe and McIntyre both attempt to recuperate a virtue-centered tradition of thinking about ethics. She is a Roman Catholic. McIntyre's text of 1981, he's still a modern pagan, which is to say a secular Aristotelian. He would become a Catholic a few years after that text, and he's been writing some fascinating texts ever since as a Catholic, building on the tradition of Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas. Anscombe remained a Catholic her whole life. So there's a sense in which there's no accident that two of the major figures within the modern academy are philosophically aligned to an Aristotelian tradition and a Thomistic tradition that is highly suspicious of modern thinking about ethics that begins with these rules and abstract principles. Or to use the language of Professor Anscombe's sister Elizabeth's dear friend and fellow genius Ludwig Wittgenstein, what does it mean to play a language game whose form of life has been lost? And therefore the major concepts in that language game are derivatives and survivals that make very little sense at all. Now what's fascinating is that Bentham, for example, when it comes to rights talks, what did he say about rights? I'm sure many of you know what Bentham's famous characterization of rights. He rights are nonsense on stilts. Nonsense on stilts. There's no such thing as rights. It's all about principles of utility. And he starts off that first line in that text. He says, nature has endowed upon human beings two sovereign masters, pleasure and pain. And the principle of utility is an attempt to ensure you maximize pleasure and minimize pain. And therefore, ethics is fundamentally about a principle of utility in which what is to be maximized, the thing to be maximized, has to do with something that is undeniable, the pleasure that we all seek and the pain we're trying to alleviate or minimize. Clarity. Wow. Interesting. And then here comes William Goodwin. I got to mention Goodwin because of my deep connection to romanticism. Brother Unger and I are going to be fighting about romanticism throughout this class. William Goodwin, he writes the piece many years before Bentham called The Archbishop and the Chambermaid. I'm sure some of you have read that text. It's a powerful text. You appeal to maximizing pleasure, creating the greater good in society. If a house is on fire and you have to choose between the archbishop who lives there or the chambermaid who's working for the archbishop, who do you save? And Goodwin says, of course, it's very clear. You save the archbishop. Makes a bigger contribution to the social good. We're sorry about the chambermaid. We have a sensibility regarding her plight. But she's got to go. We can't save her. But then the next paragraph Goodwin says, but what if that chambermaid is your mama? He doesn't say mama, I'm just blackifying it. No, we got to kind of keep it on the chocolate side sometimes. He says, what if that chambermaid is your mother? What if that chambermaid is your wife or your daughter? Then all of a sudden, the abstract appeal of this principle of utility is highly problematized. Why? Because it has to do with you as an existential person with deep attachments. And it's not going to be a matter of some kind of methodological calculation. And even if you still decide for the Archbishop, it's going to be much deeper pain. Now, if you're a good utilitarian, you hold on to your impartiality. You hold on to your impersonal way of looking at things. And the chambermaid just happens to be the person that gave birth to you, no matter what your relations were. Oh, Goodwin says, I can see that the existential dimension of ethical reflection is one that will have deep tension, if not be in profound conflict with the impersonal. And what is distinctive about utilitarianism, what is distinctive about consequentialism, what is distinctive about Kantianism is its fundamental commitment to impartiality, to the impersonal and the character of the rules or principles that will regulate how we engage in ethical thinking and ethical action. Now, we talked last week a bit about altruism, and Professor Unger, Brother Roberto is going to say much more about altruism, the selflessness, the full-scale, impersonal, and impartial orientation in which the living for others and the willingness to give up oneself downplays the existential. It's a complicated issue, and the difference between, as we'll see, love and altruism is very, very important. It sits in some ways near or at the center of this class. But utilitarianism in all of its forms, I mean, we could teach a whole year-long course in utilitarianism. There's going to be rules that maximize a particular kind of good you have in mind, especially be it pleasure, which is the adaptation of Bentham. Or will it be different kinds of pleasure, because pleasure itself is not unitary? There's a lot of different kinds of pleasure. John Stuart Mill made that clear. In his critique of Bentham, he began as an early Benthamite, has a nervous breakdown. Not just because he's utilitarian, but he reads Wordsworth, he reads romantic poets, and he says, lo and behold, there's something missing. There's higher pleasures and lower pleasures. Socrates, dissatisfied, is better than a pig satisfied. Baser pleasures that are insatiable, ephemeral, with different status than the enduring joys connected to friendship, great art, or even quasi-good art, and so forth. So, I mean, these days you always have to qualify because greatness has been so commodified, but that's just a footnote. Or, more tellingly, and this you get in the dissertation of the great John Rawls, who taught here at Harvard from Emerson Hall for almost 40 years or so now. Blessed to know him well and sit in his classes. He is the towering Kantian figure of the 20th century, the towering liberal political theorist. He wrote a dissertation at Princeton in the late 40s called A Critique of Utilitarianism. He says to be a utilitarian presupposes that you have access to some impersonal perspective. He called it an ideal observer, invoking Roger Firth, who also taught for many years here at Harvard. He's one of the last Quakers to teach in the philosophy department at Harvard. He's a magnificent human being, a very sweet and kind person. He wrote essays called The Ideal Observer. And Rawls invokes that term, and Rawls is on the way to his original position. That will be in the first pages of A Theory of Justice of 1971. And he had to give up on utilitarianism, even given the clarity in certain senses, because that ideal observer has to be cast in such a way that we can hold on to, he hopes, some of the existential concerns, but we have to make it explicit. We have to make it much more visible in the way in which we think about the world. And lo and behold, he moves into the impartiality of Immanuel Kant. And of course, Kant is the academic moral philosopher par excellence. When we think about utilitarianism, think about a Bentham or a John Stuart Mill. What is distinctive about both of them? John Stuart Mill never goes to college, never teaches in a college. He is just a great intellectual. He's not an academician. Very important. But he could never get in Oxford anyway, given the oath you had to take to the Church of England at that time. Bentham, too, reformer. Kant, academician to the core. Waiting for the utilitarian folks, saying, oh, you think you need all of that impartiality and a commitment to the impersonal? Come my way. Take a flight to Königsberg. Read my text and see the ways in which your commitment to rationality and transparency and clarity can generate a connection to being a free person who legislates to oneself the rules that one chooses as a reflection of the best of one's nature. And then we're on to the CI machinery, the categorical imperative machinery, vis-a-vis the hypothetical imperative. We won't get into all of that. But the important thing is the centrality of impartiality, the centrality of the impersonal, and the ways in which a set of rules, the ways in which a set of principles can be generated without appeals to history, without appeals to tradition, holding at arm's length contingency, holding at arm's length dynamic, concrete realities. In these particular isms, the Kantianisms and the utilitarianisms, and let's always keep in mind that anytime you talk about isms with an S, oftentimes it's very different than the initial pioneers and founders. Just like the relative last words of Karl Marx. What was that? I am not a Marxist. Why did Karl Marx say that? He looked around and saw some of those folk calling themselves Marxists. He said, no, I'm not one of those. No, I'm Karl Marx. Weber would say the same thing about Weberians and on and on. Jesus would certainly say that about Christians. Ooh. Oh, my God. Ooh. And Amos and Isaiah and Esther would say that about a lot of folk in the synagogues, right? And we won't even say what Brother Muhammad would say, looking at some of these mosques, but that's, again, just footnote. Back to the lecture. These two dominant isms based on the pioneers. And you remember last week, I invoked Kant within his lectures of Philosophical Encyclopedia. When Kant says what? These modern philosophers talking about ethics, they are artists of reason. I'm looking for artists of life. That's a reference to the older traditions of ethical reflection. Kant was aware of that. That's part of his own genius. But his legacy has been primarily one in the academy. So there's always these contradictions and always these incongruities within these towering figures. And that's very important to keep in mind. And yet the dominant orientations that flow from their texts, from their writings, especially in the academy, are holding at arm's length, especially these three fundamental challenges. And you end up with the figure Derek Parfit. He wrote a book in 1984 called Reasons and Persons. Another text, 2011, called What Matters. He was viewed as the greatest moral philosopher since the 1800s. Everybody said, oh my God, we've got to read this. I mean, when I read the review in TLS, Derek Parfit, who I'd known writing earlier essays in 71, he had written a wonderful essay on personal identity. One had to read, but when you read the whole text, the most important thinker since the 1800s, I just stopped everything. So I was on the way to get some peanut butter and jelly. I said, shoot, I'm going to skip that. Let me read Parfit and see what's going on. Everything's got to come to a stop. The greatest thinker since the 1800s. And then you got a sense, a whiff of what he's about. Brilliant, sharp. These days, given the cult of smartness, he's smart. Academician. And he ends up with the third thesis of Professor Hanscom, my dear sister Elizabeth. Lo and behold, we can be clever enough in such a way that we can make utilitarianism, consequentialism, and Kantianism say similar things. And they all lead to liberal contract theory. Ooh, that's fascinating. There's been a whole lot of ink spilt pointing out the differences here. And I should add, just a very interesting footnote. The word consequentialism first appears in the 1958 essay that I invoked earlier. First time it's ever used, 1958. And my dear brother, who I love deeply, Samuel Scheffler, now at NYU, wrote a dissertation on consequentialism, has been one of the major proponents of sophisticated forms of consequentialism. And of course, he and I have been at it for over 40 years. Because he's very aware of some of its blind spots and limitations, but it's also tied to the tradition in his own ways. But the convergence theory was amazing because people were thinking, my God, if in fact all three of these theories come together, then what is the difference that makes the difference? What is at stake here? And that's what we will be wrestling with. Is it the case that once you abstract from, distance oneself from these three challenges, that it becomes a matter of not just convergence, but being clever enough to come up with formulations that result in the same liberal, contractual, social theoretical orientation? That is acontextual, ahistorical, suspicious of the existential, especially as it relates to the concrete and the contingent. Now, you can imagine a larger analysis that brings in the relation of ideas to structures and institutions, that brings in notions of ideologies, of the various ways in which ideas are put forward, used, and deployed in such a way that they not just rationalize certain status quos, but they also hide and conceal certain challenges to the status quo. So that the individualism, the liberalism, and most importantly, the refusal to want to thoroughly interrogate both the existential self and the status quo of various social structures held at arm's length. They don't want to call into question what are the larger conditions for the possibilities of this individualism and liberalism as articulated within the varieties of moral philosophy in the academy. And so you end up by assuming and presupposing a status quo, and you end up by assuming and presupposing a certain conception of the self. It doesn't change, doesn't undergo transformation, doesn't undergo fundamental interrogation. And one can give a whole different lecture on the relation between this kind of individualism, liberalism, utilitarianism, consequentialism, vis-a-vis neoclassical economic theory, where you start with a self, pleasures, preferences, maximize those pleasures and preferences and see what kinds of market conditions would generate the possibility of you gaining access to those. No talk about a self to be interrogated, to grow, to mature, become more moral, more courageous, more visionary, just the self. And here are the preferences given what the market's providing for you. All you want to know is whether that self is an autonomous self. Autonomous from what? Or is autonomy sometimes a discourse that still hides and conceals a captivity? Not just a social and structural captivity vis-a-vis market conditions, but at an existential level. A refusal to want to take Socrates seriously. That says you've got to learn how to die in order to learn how to live, which means you've got to undergo self-change, self-transformation, self-interrogation, self-scrutiny. So when you do die, you're a different self than you are than when you first awoke, when you were first awakened, as it were. And it's here where both Anscombe and McIntyre are going to be tied to any series of moral reflection rooted in forms of paideia. Forms of paideia. And paideia is what? Formation of attention. How do you get you to attend to the things that really matter? And of course, Professor Unger, I think, noted the end of Volume 3 in Derek Parfit's text. Volume 2 was 1,440 pages. And at the end of Volume 3, he said, I find it strange that I've written all of these words and I've really said very little about what really matters. But I will deal with that in the next volume. Derek Parfit was, in many ways, a philosophically sophisticated thinker. He died January 1, 2017, so we mourn his death. But he never got to what really matters, given his starting point, given the traditions that he inherited, as it were. But the formation of attention, a wonderful line of William James, Principles of Psychology. Experience is what you agree to attend to. Simone Weil's understanding of education. The formation of attention. What you attend to says much about who you are. It's existential. It's existential. Very little talk about that formation of attention tied to transformation. Similarly so in terms of the cultivation of a critical self and the maturation of a loving soul. I want to end on this note of death as it relates to change and transformation. I think last week we talked about death, dread, despair, and disappointment, and disease, which are the inescapable realities of each and every one of us, what I call the catastrophic, as opposed to just the problematic. But this sense of learning how to die as a form of love of truth, love of goodness, love of beauty. And if you're religious like I am, a love of the holy, love of God. Learning how to die. It's not static, it's not stationary, it's not impersonal, it's not impartial. It's not even objective in terms of orientation. It is objective in terms of realities with which one must come to terms. But that learning how to die in order for a new self to be reborn. And one of the distinctive features of the traditions that take paideia seriously has much to do with this sense of taking seriously learning how to die. Being open to imagination, transformation, interrogation, and recognizing that one is finite, one is fallible. And I would say in Christian discourse, one is fallen in terms of being inadequate, in some ways wretched, to use the language of Pascal. Let me stop there because I've gone long enough. Let's open it up for questions or queries before our dear brother jumps in. Do not hesitate. Yes, my brother.
Can I ask if there is anything that is without context, without contingencies, and that is not concrete? So there is nothing that is not any of these three things outside the realm of human existence. So can you shed some light on this observation?
Whether, in fact, there's such a thing as non-contingency in a contingent world? It's an interesting question, though, brother. And what's at stake in the question?
Somehow, in your discourse, I got the sense that for philosophies to be valid,
Yes.
one needs to have these three things in place.
Absolutely.
But there is nothing in this world that we know of that is without context, contingency, or is not concrete in some way.
Absolutely. And that would be another reason why flight from context contingencies and concretes would be something we should be suspicious of. Will you accept that formulation?
I'll accept whatever you say.
No, don't accept anything I say. No. No, I just told you I'm fallible, finite, and fallen, so I could be wrong, but I don't think I am. But I could be wrong. But your question, in a way, it takes us right to the limits. You remember last week I was talking about reason's sweet shipwreck, where you begin with the limits of rational reflection, the limits of reason, and then you begin to get into paradoxes and incongruities and so forth. Usually that's where our artists are best in their characterization of who we are. How do you deal with the limits? So when you talk about the looking for the non-contingent, but if there's contingency all the way down, then where do you find the non-contingent? You're looking for, you're wrestling with context. If it's context all the way down, where do you find the non-contextual and so forth? But again, this is not in any way a relativism or any kind of sophomoric relativism. It's a description of our human condition over time, which is always changing dynamic and so forth, physiological as well as existential. Right? And so it's not an attempt to push us into some kind of paralyzing aporia. Remember we put that on the board last week. In that line 149A of Theocritus, Socrates said, I inject aporia in other folk. I inject perplexity. I inject them reaching the impasse, as it were, so that they have to come to terms with thinking about who they are. And there's a radical distinction between intellectual curiosity and existential perplexity. Not the same thing. You get intellectual curiosity among the scientists or in Descartes' methodological skepticism in the Meditations. But existential perplexities are those howls at the end of Shakespeare's King Lear. And King Lear, at that point, he's not engaging in intellectual curiosity. He's engaging in what Bob Marley would call wailing. Not whining, wailing. King Lear, Bob Marley, and the Wailers. That's coming from all the way. So I don't have an answer to your question precisely because I want to know what's at stake in it, and I want to be open to the ways in which we can reformulate some of the understandings of the relation of contingent and non-contingent. I think we all, in some sense. Yes, a question in the back. Yes, that's a goal, he said. Uh-huh. Well, one, see, I think that insecurity is inescapable. The question is how to live with it. Creativity, I would want to put tremendous weight on, but I would never give it a teleological status as the goal of man, G-O-A-L. And I'm getting that right, though, right? G-O-A-L. No, I would never say the goal of humankind is creative insecurity. No, not at all. Creativity is one of the weapons we have as human beings, just like imagination and compassion and service to others. It's one of the things available to us in order to live a life that's desirable. So that I would never view creative insecurity as the goal. I would view insecurity as an inescapable reality with which we have to come to terms. I would say creativity is one of the ways in which we attempt to live a good life, a desirable life, in order to.
How can you be creative if there isn't insecurity?
Oh, no, I mean, a lot of insecurity generates lack of creativity. But insecurity can generate creativity. The two are connected. I just wouldn't give it the status of a goal. You see, that's the larger claim that I'm calling into question. You see. What, does that make sense to you?
I just view being a couch potato is not the best place if you want to have creativity, perhaps.
Oh, well, it depends on what you're doing on the couch, though. Depends on what you're doing on the couch. I mean, John Coltrane said that Thelonious Monk wrote a lot of his songs on the couch. Did you say what?
But he worked very hard on the couch.
Oh, absolutely. And he worked hard after he left the couch in order to play. Yeah, right. Absolutely. Well, insecurity is not the only source, though. It's one source among others. It's one source among. I don't think that's the only source. There's a whole lot of different sources in that way. But no, but you see where I'm going with this in terms of acknowledging the role in which each one can play, the creative and the insecure, but also highly suspicious of lifting that up as the teleological end and aim, or the telos of the species. Yes, question. And speak up so we can all hear, my dear brother. Oh, you mean the good one example? Yes.
In relation to utilitarianism and essentially personal solidarity, I don't quite understand. Perhaps the Archbishop is a bad example. Say, another famous example in Western Canada of utilitarianism, like the murder of the farm worker by
I want to be able to hear. Though,
Louder still.
Yeah, louder. You're saying something important. I know. I can't hear it, though. That's all. Oh, no, we got some Swedes who do, some Swedes who don't. Now, we got heterogeneity in Sweden. Go right ahead.
I don't quite understand the point you made about the relationship between personal familiarity and utilitarianism.
Yes.
Perhaps the Archbishop is a bad example, but the easy way that I think about it is the murder of the pawn broker by Raskolnikov by the Dutch. Irrespective of my personal familiarity, suppose that pawn broker was my mother or my sister.
Yes.
The fact of the matter still remains that if we accept the annihilation of death for all these people that the death of that pawn broker has resulted in, the central thesis of utilitarianism still stands.
Oh, yeah. Right. No, and I appreciate that. Let me just write another name on the board as a way of giving some reference. My very dear teacher and friend and brother Bernard Williams, who wrote one of the most powerful critiques of utilitarianism against J.J.C. Smith. And his argument was that it's difficult in utilitarian orientation in the philosophic calculus to take seriously personal integrity and a conception of oneself that would not be profoundly problematized, not have to go fundamental transformation to opt for the killing of that chambermaid, or that chambermaid was your mother, as opposed to the archbishop who happens to be archbishop. Now, you acknowledge the tension. You just say the utilitarian could accept that tension and say, I know it's difficult, but we still have to deal with deaths, and somebody has to die, and therefore we still opt for the archbishop. Sorry, Mom, love you, but you got to go. And that makes sense too, but it's just an argument in which the tension is being acknowledged. And
utilitarianism presupposes that tension. It's as much pleasure for as many people as possible, not for everybody, because it recognizes that's possible. It's in the thesis itself.
well, that's a charitable reading of utilitarianism, and I'm so glad you put it forward. But the problem is, and Peter Singer, let's just put Brother Peter's name up here because he takes this about as far as you can go. Because he made it famous in terms of whether he'd do away with his grandmother based on utilitarian grounds. And he was wrestling with your question. Initially, he said yes, slept on it for a while, and said no. And he had a close relation with his grandmother. But the important thing is not just the conclusion, but is that if you have a certain conception of yourself in which personal integrity, in which serious weight ascribed to attachments of loved ones and so on, that the kind of impersonal, impartial element that is at the center of utilitarianism is something that's going to have to be questioned. Whether you end up opting for one side or the other, and I'm so glad you raised this question because it really highlights what's at stake here. Now, you read Bernard Williams' essay on this, which is basically a defense of personal integrity vis-a-vis utilitarianism, accepting the most charitable readings of utilitarianism and still opting for personal integrity, character, and so forth and so on. You begin to see why it is that the Anscombe and the McIntyres then move into a very different direction than the utilitarian one. But, I mean, part of the challenge is if you opt for technocratic rationality vis-a-vis your most precious and priceless loved ones, does that say something about your conception of yourself? That's also an existential question. And again, I don't want to bias it in such a way that if you don't, then something's wrong with you. But it's that struggle, it's that wrestling that one has to come to terms with. That's what Anscombe and McIntyre and Bernard Williams. Now again, with Singer, I'm going to put him in brackets because he's my utilitarian brother. The three that I'll have here are the critics of utilitarianism. But he's in some ways the kind of ultimate contemporary utilitarianism that has to do with infanticide and a whole host of issues that are very, very controversial. And he opts for utilitarian formulation all the way down with the exception of grandma. And even there, people go, oh, we see you're not as consistent as we can be. No, she loved me. I remember the trips in the mountains in Australia, and so forth and so on. But any other last question before one last?
Yeah, I was wondering, like moving from the realm of the idea to the more, let's say, practical part, talking about learning how to die. How is your application in your daily life of this principle?
Oh, I try to die every day. Try to die every day, very much so. And that every day means self-criticism, self-examination, acknowledging my gangster proclivity. That's an existential issue. Now you remember in the Koine Greek, the New Testament Christians, that Paul says Christians must die daily. Dorothy Day wrote the eulogy for Martin Luther King Jr. April 5th, 1968. The Catholic worker, what did she say? Martin Luther King Jr. learned how to die daily. Both pagan, going back to the Greeks, profoundly legacy of Jerusalem, working through Hebrew scripture and Koine Greek scripture. And so in one's own life, one attempts to engage in some, serious Socratic self-interrogation without it resulting in self-flagellation and self-violation. And that's always a challenge because you can imagine serious self-interrogation can lead to self-hatred, can lead to self-torture, it can lead to self-flagellation. But the question is, how do you hold those at arm's length and still take seriously your failings, your inadequacies, your relative wretchedness, and bounce back with the capacity to be creative, compassionate, courageous, and so forth and so on. But I know we better turn it over to our dear brother.
So in the spirit of continuing this discussion, I make remarks with a twofold purpose. The first purpose is to develop the contrast between the agenda that we propose in this course and the agenda of academic meta-ethics. And the second purpose is to suggest what is, in a sense, the common ground of those modern first-order projects that I exemplified on the blackboard last week. By contrast, not only to academic meta-ethics, but also to the ancient projects that were on the left-hand column last week. And in this spirit, with these two purposes in mind, I will proceed in 3 steps. In the first step, to present a contrast, a contrast between the conception of the moral project that is espoused by the academic meta-ethics and the one that interests us here for its own sake and as the common ground of those modern first-order ideas about the moral life. In the second part of my remarks, I then want to develop one side of this alternative agenda, the alternative to academic meta-ethics, the side that has to do with the relation of the self to other people. And in the third part of the remarks, I then want to explore the other side of this alternative agenda, the side that relates to our relation not to the other people, but to the structure, in particular the structure of society, the social and cultural world that we inhabit, but also the structure in another sense, which is the rigidified form of our own self, our character. Now, first then, the contrast of the two agendas. Remember Parfit's thesis that the 3 main meta-ethical positions, social contract, consequentialism or utilitarianism, and Kantianism or deontology, are equivalent. They are ascents up the same mountain from different sides of the mountain. And I then suggested to you 3 interpretations of this equivalence, of its significance. One interpretation, the interpretation that Parfit himself defends, is that they are equivalent because they are true. The second interpretation is that they are equivalent because they are empty. They are 3 elastic languages in which almost any moral proposition can be expressed and defended. And the third interpretation that is not necessarily in contradiction with the second is that they are equivalent because they express a certain interpretation of the moral problem, which is that the essential problem in the moral life is the containment and overcoming of selfishness. And the solution is the defense of altruism in the form of universal rules or principles that will discipline our self-centeredness. Now then, in this first set of remarks, I want to explore that third interpretation of the equivalence with the aim of working out the contrast between the two agendas. The first line of contrast is that in this agenda of academic meta-ethics, the central problem of moral life is defined as selfishness. And the containment of selfishness anchored in our self-centeredness. We begin by thinking that each of us is the center of the world and discover that we're not. And we have to organize morality as a campaign against selfishness. In the alternative view, there is a different conception of the central problem of the moral life. The central problem of the moral life in this alternative view is that the conditions for self-assertion, for the development of a personality, for the enhancement of our agency, our capacity to act in the world, are contradictory. There is a contradiction or a series of contradictions in the conditions of self-assertion. And these contradictions threaten to deny us the full possession of life. So first, with respect to our relations to the others, the contradiction is this, that we need them. We develop ourselves only through connection, but every connection threatens us with some form of subjugation or depersonalization. And therefore, we seem forced to choose at every turn between acceptance of this subjugation and isolation. So, no one saves himself on this view. Everyone has to be saved by the others. But Jean-Paul Sartre says, hell are the others. And somehow these two propositions have to be combined in the way that we deal with our moral experience. That's the first contradiction. The second contradiction is that to develop a personality, to enhance our agency, to come into the possession of life, we have to engage in a particular social and cultural world. A world that we did not make, that we found around us. And it seems that to engage fully in that world, we have to surrender to it. We have to accept it on its terms. And the alternative to surrender is estrangement. And if we are estranged, practically or spiritually and psychologically, we are also blocked. And these conditions, therefore, also seem to be in contradiction. So on this alternative view, that is the problem of the moral life. That the most fundamental conditions for the affirmation of personality, for living, for possessing life, seem to be in contradiction with each other. Now comes a second level of the contrast between the two agendas. In the first agenda, in the agenda of academic metaethics, the controlling ambition is the ambition to be blameless, to be innocent. So the picture of the moral life is that it is like a book of accounts. We have obligations to the others. We must be sure that we come to the end of our days having paid all of our moral debts, fulfilled our obligations, so that our hands will be clean. Our moral campaigns then begin and end in hand washing. And at the end, we want our hands to be as clean as were the hands of Pontius Pilate after he washed them. So that then is a conception of what what the aspiration is. Blamelessness. Now, the controlling ambition in the other agenda is not the ambition to be blameless, to be innocent, but to achieve some form of breakthrough, of transformation that allows us, if not to overcome, at least to moderate those contradictory requirements of self-assertion that I described a moment ago. At the third level, the contrast is a contrast with respect to the basic view of the solution. What is the antidote to the problem? And what is the instrument for realizing the ambition? In the agenda of academic metaethics, the fundamental antidote is altruism, universalism, impartiality, a point of view in which we cease to regard ourselves, each of us ceases to regard himself as the center. And in the other agenda, the antidote is some way of living that allows us to achieve the breakthrough, the transformation that would moderate the contradiction in the conditions of self-assertion. Finally, at the fourth level, the contrast between these two agendas is a contrast between two ways to organize our ideas in pursuit of these contrasting projects. In the agenda of the academic metaethics, there are three crucial steps reproduced in each of the three major positions. The first step is to have a method, a philosophical method of choice and of justification. The utilitarian calculus, the device of the social contract and of the veil of ignorance, or the categorical imperative inferred from the enabling conditions of moral life. The second step is to generate, through the deployment of this method, a set of criteria that have general form. And the third step, then, is to generate out of the application of the criteria universal rules. That's how we organize our thought in the pursuit of that first agenda. Now, in the pursuit of the second agenda, how do we organize our thought? The basic problem is that there is no method. There is no proxy for the idea of a method in the first agenda. But we do need to form ideas about the transformation of our practices, of our way of living. And in that effort, one of the crucial problems is the relation between routines or repetitions and the defiance of routine. So to come fully into the possession of life, we have to rebel against the formulaic and repetitious element in life, conformity, and to be ready to disrupt and to innovate. But Kierkegaard observed that the war against repetition is a war against life, because a large part of life is inescapably repetition. So the problem cannot be resolved by the simple suppression of repetition, as the romantic imagination would want, but by some interplay between the repetitious and the innovative elements in moral experience. Now, with that contrast outlined, let me then proceed to the second set of remarks. And the second set of remarks is then to explore schematically one side of the contradictory requirements of self-assertion, the side that has to do with the relation of the self to the others. Remember the basic problem in this view that I'm claiming is a common anxiety of all those modern projects. The problem is that we need the others, and the others threaten us. We need connection. Every connection is a risk of subjugation or depersonalization. How can we connect without having to pay this price of subjugation and depersonalization? And in this way, moderate the conflicting requirements of self-assertion. Well, one partial answer that is given in this tradition is that in a certain domain of life, we can hope to achieve reconciliation with the others through love. Love is the limiting experience of reconciliation. And therefore, love is defined as a moral experience different from altruism. Now let me then contrast in this spirit love and altruism as part of this attempt to establish the larger contrast between the two agendas. So first, the ground of a principle of altruism, defined in any of those three meta-ethical positions, is this problem of the containment or supersession of selfishness and self-centeredness. The ground of the problem of love is reciprocal acceptance and recognition between people, between two people. It's not a problem about selfishness. It's a problem about being able to establish a connection with them that enhances the self rather than threatening it, that is part of its possession, of its self-possession, of its entering fully into life. Second, altruism is offered from on high or from a distance. Altruism need not be reciprocal or equal, and indeed, it is more perfect on its own understanding if it is not reciprocal. It is the offer of a gift in return for nothing. And therefore, the giver of the altruism is in this godlike position. But love presupposes the meeting with the other on a plane of possible equality, of reciprocity, with the consequent risk of rejection or failure. And that then leads to a third and fundamental contrast. Altruism requires sacrifice, but it does not involve any intimate jeopardy of the self. The self is in the godlike position. Love does involve jeopardy at many different levels. Now let me describe this jeopardy in particular. And in the course of describing the jeopardy, establish a contrast between the position I'm taking here and the position that I attribute to romanticism. In the eyes of my friend here, I have long been fallen under suspicion of being a romantic. But I regard romanticism as a heresy being the perversion of a spiritual truth. So the spiritual truth is the centrality of the interpersonal, of personality and interpersonal connection in our lives. But this insight is perverted in romanticism, which, like all heresies, results from a deficiency of hope, as I next want to demonstrate. So first, there is a threshold risk or form of jeopardy in love, which is the ability to imagine the other person. And the romantic doubts whether it is possible to imagine another person, even though he seeks salvation in the other person. The philosopher Heraclitus in the pre-Socratic fragments is supposed to have said, the soul of another person is a dark continent that can never be visited. It's this idea of the obscurity of the other. Altruism requires no imagination of the other, simply a practical view of a need that is assuaged. But the preliminary problem in love is the ability to imagine the other, to imagine the otherness of the other, so that the love not be, as the romantics fear and inevitably is, a projection on the other of the self. Now comes the second form of jeopardy, absent from altruism: the failure of reciprocity, the rebuff, the breakdown, against which there is no protection. The third form of jeopardy has to do with the translation of the experience of love into routine. So a characteristic of the romantic imagination is this idea that there is an insuperable abyss, a contradiction between spirit and structure. Structure being repetition or formula or institution. So the moment of romantic love, by contrast to the routines of married life, or the crowd in the streets in the revolutionary moment, by contrast to the bureaucratic repetitions of normal political life, and so forth. The romantic idea is the idea that structure in all of its forms is like the hand of Midas that kills the spirit. But on this view, structure is inevitable, and the wavering of hope. We can't change the character of structure. All we can do is temporarily shake the hold of the structure on our experience. And in those interludes of the shaking of the structure, we will really live. We will be ourselves. So notice that in the early romantic novel, one of the central experiences is love, and its association with the struggle of the protagonist against society and its structure. And the reward in the end is the marriage. But the marriage is not represented in the romantic novel because the marriage is unimaginable for a romantic. It is the structure that kills love. D.H. Lawrence says marriage is a long conversation, but it's full of repetition. It's a formula, and this is intolerable to the romantic. So what the romantic cannot imagine is that we could create a structure in personal or in social life that would be hospitable to the spirit, that we could not just shape the structure temporarily, but that we could over time come to change the relation between structure and spirit. And the fourth form of jeopardy is the manifest inadequacy of love as an ideal for the organization of society as a whole. It's about the pianissimo. It's about the intimate sphere. What about society as a whole? There has to be some counterpart to it, and the romantic suspects that there is no counterpart to it. So spirit must be then a continuous insurrection of the self or of a small group of people against the larger social world. So love then is the limiting case. Love is different from altruism. And in this modern tradition, contrary to what the meta-ethical thinkers supposed, we come to think that altruism is not the highest form of moral experience. There's something higher than it, which is love. Now then the question arises in relation to that fourth form of jeopardy, the insufficiency of love as an organizing principle for society, whether there is a counterpart to it. And in this tradition, the tradition of the modern projects, we come to think that the counterpart to love in society is cooperation. Cooperation among free and equal agents. And now come the formidable problems of translating this ideal of cooperation into detailed institutional arrangements. In the most general terms, what should the attributes of these institutional arrangements be so that the higher forms of cooperation can serve as the counterparts to love in the wider organization of society? So let me give you a list of some of the exemplary attributes of this function, which then begin to build a bridge between moral thinking and political thinking. So first, the cooperative regime should not tie our hands in developing new ways of cooperating with one another. The ways in which we cooperate with one another should not be constrained in particular by some entrenched scheme of social division and hierarchy that tells us that only members of a certain class or caste can do this or can do that. Second, the form of cooperation should not be pinned down to a single version of itself. There should not be a definitive institutional formula for the market economy or for democracy. Now, this may seem like an innocent concession, but in fact, it has decisive implications. In classical liberal political theory, one of the central ideas is that we should strive to establish an institutional framework and a system of law that is neutral among clashing visions of the good. There is no institutional framework that is neutral. Every institutional framework tilts the scales of human experience in one direction or another. So the false ideal of neutrality has as its practical consequence its opposite, namely the entrenchment of some sectarian vision of humanity under the disguise of neutrality. Nevertheless, the illusory and dangerous goal of neutrality has a relationship to a legitimate and immensely important goal. Not that the institutional framework be neutral, but that it be open, that it be Catholic, that it be receptive to contradiction and to variety, and above all, that it be corrigible in the light of experience, that we can challenge it from within, that we can disrupt it. And that is the legitimate residue of the dangerous ideal of neutrality. So what it means, for example, is that we should not think, as the practical economists do tend to think, that the market economy has a single natural and necessary form. Now comes different regimes of property and contract should coexist experimentally within the same free economic order. Now comes a third attribute of these arrangements that I'm calling the higher forms of cooperation. The individual should be as much as possible secure in a haven of protected vital interests, immunities, and endowments that are taken out of the agenda of short-term politics, so that the rest of social life can be thrown open to radical innovation and disruption. Now, to understand this conception of fundamental rights and endowments, think of the following analogy. The parent says to the child, "I love you unconditionally. Now go out into the world and raise a storm." So the fundamental security of the child is then an enabling condition for the transformative activity of the child in the world. Now, what happens in the conventional discourse of human rights is that there's the story about the protection, but there isn't the story about the storm. The storm is the point of it. And the storm has to be organized. It has to have institutional conditions, this ability to innovate and to disrupt. Now let me give you a fourth attribute, which has to do with the relation of the self to our devices, like our machines. Under most of the prior forms of economic organization, the worker works as if he were one of his machines. In Henry Ford's assembly line or in Adam Smith's pin factory, the worker mimics his machines. But this is the opposite of what we should imagine machines are for. Everything that we have learned how to repeat, we express in a formula or an algorithm, and everything that we can express in a formula or algorithm, we embody in a contraption, the machine. The machine does for us everything that we have learned how to repeat, so that our supreme and, in our sense, our only resource can be reserved for the not yet repeatable. And then the worker becomes an anti-machine working with the machine, one step ahead of the machine. And that is also one of the characteristics of the higher forms of cooperation. Now, that fourth characteristic is unlikely ever to happen unless work becomes really free. So there are three forms of free work, of free labor. Wage labor, economically dependent wage labor, self-employment, and cooperation. The liberals and the socialists in the 19th century understood that economically dependent wage labor is a transient and defective form of free labor, retaining many of the characteristics of slavery and serfdom. And labor is only really free when it takes its higher forms, but the higher forms have to be reconciled with the requirements of large-scale aggregation of resources. And that, in turn, demands legal and institutional innovation, and so forth. So what I'm trying to suggest by this list is that the ideal of the higher forms of cooperation is not empty. On the contrary, it has explosive content. We give it content, and by giving it content, then we vindicate this idea that there is a counterpart to love in the wider organization of society as a way of reconciling that basic contradiction between our need for the others and the jeopardy in which they place us. Now comes the second large dimension of these contradictions, our relation to the structure of society. Remember what the contradiction is. To develop a self, we need to engage in a particular world. But it seems that to engage in a particular world, we need to surrender to it. So we should not, to be ourselves, we must not be forced to choose between estrangement and surrender. How can we be in the world without being entirely of it? How can we engage without surrendering? It's again the problem of structure against the Romantics. How can we organize a structure in the economy and politics that allows us to engage without surrender? Now, this is a direct problem of institutional design in the economy and in politics. It's not just a philosophical abstraction. It goes to the heart of many of the central economic and political problems. And in approaching this problem, we today have a problem that our predecessors never had. Like the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, we recognize, or we must recognize, the primacy of structural change. It's the supreme object of political ambition, is to change the regime, the economic regime or the political regime. All fundamental problems in society depend on structural innovation. But unlike the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, we cannot bring ourselves to believe in the definitive adequacy of any particular institutional formula. So how can we imagine and create structural alternatives without succumbing to a structural dogmatism? That is a problem for which there exists no precedent in historical experience, and that is part of our problem. And therefore, one of the most important characteristics of the institutional arrangements is that they lay themselves open to revision, that they in some way organize their own disruption, that they help us turn against them. And then that would be part of the solution to this problem of how we can engage in a world without surrendering to it. Now, there is a counterpart to this collective or institutional problem in our relation to our own selves. The rigidified form of the self is the character. The habitual form of the self. The Greeks said character is destiny. And the character then comes to stand in the place of the self. We have a problem in the relation to this rigidified form of the self that is analogous to the problem that we have in our relation to the established institutional form of society. And this problem becomes manifest in the normal course of a human life through a series of turning points in our experience. None of this, of course, is discussed in the agenda of academic metaethics, but it's fundamental to our moral experience. So consider these three moments in a human life. So first, very early on, there's the moment of decentering. Each of us discovers that he is not the center. That's then the provocation for this perspective of the metaethics. And then we can move in two directions in our thinking. We can begin to think that the fundamental problem is our obligations to the others. What do we owe them, given that we're not the center? The moral life as a book of accounts. Or we can think that the fundamental problem is the reconciliation with the others. At the limit through love, but socially or politically through the organization of these higher cooperative regimes. Then comes a second turning point, early in our lives, in our youth, as we begin to come to maturity. We discover that to be something in the world, we have to be a particular thing, rather than the universal human being. And that means that each of us, even the most privileged, has to, in a sense, mutilate himself to be something and cease to be many other things. And this mutilation then is part of our central experience. Now, in mutilating ourselves in this way, how can we continue to, as it were, imagine the missing limbs? That is, imagine the other selves that we could have been as one of the fundamental foundations for our imaginative empathy, for our ability to engage in one another's lives. Now then comes the third turning point, and this third turning point is of particular interest to the problems that I've been discussing. As we grow older, a carapace of routine and compromise begins to form around each of us. A mummy. It's a combination of the habitual or rigidified form of the self with the compromises of a normal human life. And we begin to understand that that life that we are living is the only life that we will ever live. And in this mummy, this combination of social compromise and characterological rigidity, each of us begins to die. Many small deaths. So then a task becomes somehow to break out of the mummy. We can't break out of the mummy just by an act of will, but we can put ourselves through acts of will into situations that disrupt us and break the mummy in the hope of coming more fully into the possession of life. And then arises the ideal which is suggested by this whole way of thinking as a shared concern of these modern projects. The ideal is to come fully and constantly into the possession of life. Life comes before good and evil. To come so fully into the possession of life that we die only once. Now we still have time to talk.
Wonderful question. We got a hand right away in the middle.
Yes. I have a question about this description of the contradiction between engaging in the world, so we either have to surrender or be estranged.
Yes.
I'm wondering the degree to which that neglects the distinction between our internal and external experiences. So it seems to me possible to
A little louder, please.
I'm thinking about the way that the distinction between surrendering and being estranged from the world neglects a distinction
From a particular social world.
Yes.
Yes.
might neglect the distinction between our internal and external experiences. Which is to say, it seems to me possible to surrender to the world outwardly and maintain an internal estrangement. So
Of course.
I can surrender to the needs of this class, to have me sitting here and internally can feel estranged as the first woman to speak, for example.
Of course.
So I'm
Correct. So it seems to me that in using the vocabulary that I suggested, what you're describing is not the supersession of the contradiction, but the combination of the opposing evils in the same personal experience. So you're not describing a situation in which the person has discovered a way to participate fully, intensely in the particular world, while reserving the last word for himself rather than for that world. You're describing a situation in which the person has externally surrendered, but remains inwardly alienated. And many philosophers have described this experience. For example, Hegel's description of the spiritual situation in the late Roman Empire before Christianity is that its citizens were chained, but they sung in their chains. So they adopted these esoteric forms of spirituality that coexisted with their external surrender to the established order. So I fully accept that. That not only is that possible, but we know for a fact that that's a very common way in which this contradiction is dealt with. But it's not an example of the overcoming of what I was calling the breakthrough. It's an example of the opposite.
Any other women? No, I appreciate that. Any other women want to raise their hand? If not, then let's go to these brothers. Oh, there's this.
When you talk about love and repetition, I think about ritual, like and ritual and faith, and I'm wondering if you can speak more on that. And the second question that I had with Professor West is, you were talking about the need for self-criticism to die every day in a kind of millennial discourse where like the self is conceived as this very fragile thing. Like we talk about self-care, we talk about self-love, like and sort of like coddling of the self. And so I wonder how that orientation kind of squares up with some of the young folks in this room to have a different kind of acculturation around what the self is.
Wonderful question. You go right ahead.
No, you first.
I think the mainstream, highly popular discourse of a fragile self, which is a self that in some ways is plastic because the market has rendered any conception of a self as one difficult to have solidity. The difference between a personality and character, for example. Lionel Trilling talks about this in the Norton Lecture, Sincerity and Authenticity. What happens in a culture in which personality is something that is not just socially constructed, but is something that's self-imposed, changeable over time, just like a consumer that goes to a grocery store and chooses different kind of commodities week after week. Difference from an existential wrestling that produces character, which is always dynamic now. So that's what's similar. The contingency of a market-driven self is different than the contingency of existential wrestling that produces a character. But that character is tied to traditions. It's tied to stories and narratives. It's what I was calling paideia in this sense of deep education. So that there's some seemingly overlap, but it's very, very different, it seems to me, in terms of what substance and character is. Does that begin to get at your question?
So
because I do want to say a word about the romantic elements of my brother's project.
Yes, and I want to also anticipate the theme set for next week, which is Emerson and the ideal of autonomy.
Is that what's next week, Ralph? Perfect, yeah. Perfect.
So, because there we see this central ideal of resistance to conformity as the condition for the construction of the self.
Right.
But it's very limited. It's very incomplete unless we see it as part of this larger story. The simple rebellion the iconoclastic impulse against the established order, against repetition, is sterile unless it's part of some larger project for the transformation of moral and collective life. And so that already anticipates a discussion for next week.
Absolutely. One
more thing that I do want to say, just to redress what I see as a defect in this exposition of mine from a moment ago, is that these contradictory requirements of self-assertion in the relation between self and others, or self and the social world, all take place under a shadow. And the shadow is the shadow of those irreparable flaws in the human condition, as I described them. Our mortality, our groundlessness, our insatiability, and our susceptibility to belittlement. That changes everything. And we cannot have an adequate picture of the situation unless we understand that relation, the relation between the contradictions and the shadow.
Absolutely.
It's almost entirely absent from the benign, innocuous, anodyne account of the moral life in the metaethical theorists.
Absolutely.
From reading their works, you wouldn't guess what we're actually like, that we're condemned to die.
Those are the radical contingencies.
That we don't understand the framework, that we're insatiable, that at every turn we're being humiliated and frustrated. That's what it's really like. And an account of the moral life has to understand that. So the power of this ideal of coming into the possession of life is very closely related to that shadow. It's a response to that experience. Under the shadow, we live. We come fully into the possession of life. I don't agree with your account of your own experience as dying a little bit every day. I think you misdescribed the experience. You're not dying. You're doing the opposite. You're living. There's no life without death. Yes, but your preparation for death is not your dying.
That particular kind of death. Particular kind of death.
But
if you get a
divorce,
you die.
But what is rejected? What is rejected in this agenda, in this moral agenda, is what you could call death by installments. So in other words, it's the diminishment of the experience of agency of life.
Yeah.
By this mummification.
But see, this is part of our difference in terms of let me be clear about this. Romanticism, capital R, is different than romanticism, small r, with an S. And the romantic tropes you get in the Keats and the Shelley and the Byron have to do with disruption, transformation, have to do with transgression, and even revolution. And now Brother Roberto wants to hold on to those tropes, but he's read Marx and Durkheim and Weber. He's read historical sociology, so he knows somehow there's got to be ways of talking about structure and institution that can preserve those tropes in such a way that they don't end up just being rituals expressed like Mardi Gras, and everybody breaks loose, and then you fall right back into order and structure after it's over. See, that's only a certain version of romanticism. So if there's romantic tropes that are then deployed in order to, after having read historical sociology, want to preserve innovation, transformation, I see that still at work in what you're doing, in part with the backdrop of the existential limitation.
I don't know about the labels of romantic or not, but what's central is this hope, the hope of transformation. So
yes.
Is there the hope of increasing our power to imagine the others? Is there the hope of surviving
empathy,
the rejection, the rebuff, the failure? Is there the hope of changing the relation between self and structure rather than just periodically shaking the structure? Is there the hope of finding a counterpart in the larger life of society to this experience of personal reconciliation? Those are the crucial questions. And if you then take the position that there is such a hope, the hope of transformation, of breakthrough, then you've gone beyond the limits of the romantic imagination.
Well, there's thin hope and there's thick hope. And that's very important. Because there's no such thing as just hope, capital H. And it's like Thucydides in the Million Dialogues, he talks about hope as comforts, dangers that can leave you without protection, at least towards self-destruction. That's disenabling hope. He calls it blind hope. You see, Aeschylus does the same thing in Prometheus play. But a mature hope is what you're after, not that blind hope. You're after a mature hope that is mindful of what the impediments and mindful of what the obstacles would be. And I do see that operating in Keats. I do see that operating in the late Shelley. I do see that operating. We're going to read Emerson next week. Is Emerson a romantic, small r?
We're way out of time.
Interesting. Are we?
Our
Oh,
time's
yeah.
over.